Very good evening and welcome back to our special BBC election coverage. Most of the results are now in, but there are still some crucial ones to come. Labour have in fact won the local elections in England, taking key councils such as Westminster, Wandsworth and Southampton. Although Sir Keir Starmer's celebrations were rather marred when Durham police announced it would, after all, investigate whether he broke lockdown rules last year. Boris Johnson admitted his party had a tough night, losing overall control of councils such as West Oxfordshire and Worcester, and the losses really began to mount during the day. Greens have been doing very well, and indeed Sir Ed Davies' Lib Dems have gained more seats than any other party in England. They're now in overall control of Kingston upon Hull and Somerset. Some rather happy faces in Glasgow, the SNP and supporters celebrating winning the local elections in Scotland ahead of Labour, who pushed the Tories into third place there. Results still coming in parts of Wales, with the Conservatives suffering significant losses in Denbighshire and Monmouthshire. But perhaps the most significant result today will come in Northern Ireland, where my colleague Anita McVeigh is watching the events unfold there.
Yes, Huw, still a way to go here, but it does look, as polls suggested, that Sinn Fein will emerge as the biggest party in Northern Ireland for the first time. As I say, still quite a lot of the count to go, but the leader of Sinn Fein, Huw McDonald, is calling this the election of a generation. I'll be talking to her in a few minutes.
Anita, many thanks. And Rita's also with us, Rita Chakrabarti, at the touchscreen, keeping track of the latest details there. And Professor Sir John Curtis is still with us, still awake and still alert. We'll be shedding light on the key political contest for us. Our team of correspondents at all the important counts, the ones that are left, of course, and we'll be joined by two seasoned political commentators to discuss the results and what they mean for the party leaders. I'll introduce them properly in a moment. So join us for the voters' verdict in Election Day on the BBC. Yes, indeed. Warm welcome back to the BBC's election studio here at New Broadcasting House in London. And we've been on air virtually since, when was it? 11:45 last night. Overnight, of course, lots of those English results coming in, suggesting a bit of a tricky night for Boris Johnson as it started. That's become more tricky as the night and day has gone on. For Labour, of course, some good news in London, but elsewhere they've had rather mixed set of results, I think it's fair to say. Lib Dems, some celebrating to do, the Greens as well. We'll be keeping tabs on all of that, the latest result in Wales and in Scotland, and crucially in Northern Ireland, where it's all about the makeup of a new assembly at Stormont and who might the new First Minister be. We already know that history's been made because Sinn Féin has topped the poll there for the first time, pushing the Unionists into second place. So it's already a very significant contest in so many ways, but we'll need to discuss really how that might unfold in the days and weeks ahead. So plenty of time to do that, and we'll be doing that in the company of John Curtis and other guests, and my special guest here in the studio who I'll talk about in just a moment. So stay with us for that, because I want to take a quick break for the news first with Sean. Hi, Sean.
Good evening to you, Huw, and good evening to you at home. Here's a summary of the news. The Prime Minister says it's been a tough election for the Conservatives as the party lost hundreds of seats. Labour took some of the Tories' flagship councils in London but made few significant gains elsewhere. It was a good night all round for the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. In Scotland, the SNP has once again finished as the largest party. Labour has come second. The Conservatives suffered heavy losses. Here's our political editor Laura Koonsberg, whose report does contain some flashing images.
OK, folks, this is going well.
Trademark optimism, despite shedding councils and losing nearly 400 councillors too. But in the safety of a primary school classroom in his constituency, the Prime Minister didn't seem downcast.
That's very good, that blue margin there you've done. What about some sort of baubles here?
He lost iconic London councils, giving away comfortable Conservative ground.
And what are we going to have when we have the party?
Yet anger at Downing Street parties and his fine for breaking the law
There you go.
did not translate into the catastrophe some Conservatives had feared.
It's mid-term and it's certainly a mixed set of results, and we've had a tough night in some parts of the country, but on the other hand, in other parts of the country, you're still seeing Conservatives going forward and making quite remarkable gains in places that haven't voted Conservative for a long time, or if ever.
Not in London, where his Labour rival had big reasons to smile this morning, winning over territory held by the Tories for decades.
We've just done it! Yes! Westminster! Yes! Wandsworth!
Steps forward, but outside London, perhaps not big, bold strides Labour needs.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Have you heard from Durham Police, Sir Keir? Any comment on their investigation?
Yet as he travelled to celebrate success elsewhere, allegations over lockdown chased the Labour leader. Durham Police will now investigate claims that Keir Starmer broke the rules, having beer and curry with colleagues during lockdown.
Anything to say about the investigation, Sir Keir? Have you heard from Durham Police?
He's always said nothing went wrong, but they are questions Keir Starmer will have to answer. Voters' response to the Lib Dems was warm in many places, grabbing seats from Labour in the northern city Hull, from the Tories in Kent's Tunbridge Wells, Somerset and pockets of affluent London. The message to the Tories from some green suburbs will cause Tory nerves.
They're saying they've had enough of this Prime Minister. And I think the tectonic plates of British politics are shifting. And now it's up to Conservative MPs to shove the Prime Minister into the abyss.
Remember, your votes stitch together a giant patchwork, not a picture that's the same in every corner of the country.
You're my mum's counsellor, yeah?
There was striking Labour success in London that will hurt for the Tories, who broadly fell back further in the south than in the north of England, their coalition fraying more at its traditional end. But Labour's jubilation in the capital wasn't always matched by enthusiasm elsewhere. The Greens picking up pace too, with dozens of gains. But while results in England perhaps confirmed much of the status quo, the scene is set for a genuine moment of change in Northern Ireland. Look at this. For the first time, voters seem poised to make Sinn Féin the biggest party. That would be a moment of history and a moment of challenge and uncertainty for the UK.
I'm very grateful for all those people that came out and engaged in what was a very positive campaign.
Leaders whose dream is leaving the Union for a united Ireland would be in charge. Yay! And that could also shift the political conversation in Scotland, where the SNP, who also want to leave the UK, continue their years of dominance. Crucially, Labour moves up into second place. The Scottish Tories in a slump. And grew in Wales too, the biggest party profiting at the expense of the Tories.
Yet, spin back a few weeks, many Tories in there feared a complete calamity. They've had a terrible time in some parts of the country, but this hasn't been a wipeout. And Labour has moved forward, but not far or fast enough to be sure of power. Remember, these elections give us clues, not concrete convictions of what's coming next. But it seems the two big parties are somehow locked in an uncomfortable status quo.
That is very good.
No dramatic breakthrough for his main rival, no total breakdown for the Conservatives. Boris Johnson has taken knocks today, but still stands to carry on. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Police in Durham are investigating whether Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer broke lockdown rules on a visit during which he drank beer in an MP's office. The force initially decided that no offence had occurred in April last year, but said it had since received significant new information. Here's what the Labour leader had to say in reacting to the news this evening.
As I've explained a number of times, we were working in the office, we stopped for something to eat, no party, no breach of the rules. The police obviously have got their job to do, we should let them get on with it, but I'm confident that no rules were broken. Meanwhile, we've had a really good set of results today.
The SNP has emerged as the winner of the elections in Scotland. Labour has overtaken the Conservatives to become the second largest party for the first time in 6 years. With all results now declared, the SNP has gained 23 seats, while Labour has added 19. The Conservatives lost 62 of theirs. In Wales, Labour made gains while the Conservatives suffered significant losses. The latest results show Labour has gained 50 seats and now controls 6 of the Welsh councils. Plaid Cymru has gained 3 seats and now oversees 2 councils. And if you want to find out the results in your part of the UK, do head to the BBC News website or BBC News app and enter your postcode. You'll also find lots of election analysis and the latest reports from our teams still monitoring counts around the country. Those are the main headlines. Now back to election 2022.
Well, welcome back once again. I want to say a proper welcome to Alison Phillips of The Mirror and to Christopher Hope of The Daily Telegraph. Hello. Nice to see you both. What I want to do first, if you can bear with us, is to get the latest on what's happening in Northern Ireland. And then we'll come back and talk a bit about that and then maybe the picture across the UK as well, OK? But you're both very welcome. Look at the state of the parties then in the Northern Ireland Assembly, because we're still talking about work in progress here, with Sinn Fein on 29% of those first preference votes, the DUP in second place, Alliance in third place, the Ulster Unionists in fourth place on 11%, the SDLP on 9%, and then a bit of a bump up for the traditional Unionist voice on 8%, 5% up from last time. If we look at the seats themselves, there are 90 seats, 26 of them declared. So as I was saying, it's taking a while to get through them. And in fact, we may not get through them all even before midnight tonight, but I'll have a word about that in a second. So far, Sinn Féin on 16, the Alliance on 3, the Ulster Unionists on 3, the DUP on 2, and the SDLP on 1, the Independents on 1. This is in from the electoral office in Northern Ireland. I'd like to show you this so that you can see what kind of timings we're talking about. Watching the transfer of votes at this stage, and parcels often being small, it is likely that we will move into a second day at all venues. Yes? Update in a few hours. Well, I think we can take it for granted then, given that very strong hint that we're going to be going into tomorrow in terms of the count in Northern Ireland. So with that in mind, let's join Anita, and Anita's got a guest with her, and then we'll talk a little more about the developments. Anita, what's the latest you have?
Huw, thank you very much. Yes, still a long way to go. As you say, only 26 of the 90 seats here declared so far. And as you were mentioning, the counts at the 3 centres around Northern Ireland, including here in Belfast, going into a second day, although the original plan had been to try to get everything wrapped up today. Well, of course, one of the big stories that we've been talking about in this election campaign, and that polls have suggested, is that Sinn Féin, the nationalist party that would like to see a united Ireland, would emerge as the biggest party in Northern Ireland. And certainly, according to what we're seeing, the percentage of votes, first preference votes, and all the indications so far, that they will indeed emerge as the biggest party. And with me now, I have the leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald. Thank you very much for joining us on BBC News today. And a lot of people have talked about this prospect of Sinn Féin being the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly as being hugely symbolic. You've called it the election of a generation, but is it more than symbolic?
It is, not least because this election has been very much about change. Yes, it's about delivery in the here and now. We're in a cost of living crisis. We've issues with our health service and so on. but there's a real appetite for partnership politics, for progress, for advancement, and working together in that regard. And you know, your viewers should remember that this place in the north of Ireland was designed specifically to copper fasten a unionist majority in perpetuity. The unionist electoral majority is gone now for a number of elections, and now on the cusp of perhaps for the first time a nationalist or Republican leading the executive in the north is hugely significant, and it's more than symbolism, Anita. It's a real message about equality. It says to the world there is no job, there is no role that is off limits for anyone, and I think that's a hugely significant moment.
Yet the DUP, if they do indeed emerge as the second largest party, they have consistently not answered that question. Would they nominate to the position of Deputy First Minister? What's your message for the DUP?
Well, look, I think that is hugely disappointing. In fact, those that call themselves Democrats have to respect the view of the people. You know, the votes have been cast, the votes are now being counted. And for a long time, we served, along with our DUP colleagues, in that shared office, in the deputy position. And now it's very important that the DUP send a message that they are up for power sharing and that they will meet us with equality and meet us with respect. So that's the challenge for Jeffrey Donaldson and his party.
Yeah, and he said that he will be there on day one after this election. But I suppose my question for all of the politicians is, what does day one mean? Does it mean day one of actually getting back to work in the true meaning of the word? Because we've had so much dysfunction in politics here where the executive hasn't been functioning. So how on earth are you going to break that logjam?
Well, let me tell you, day one means that we get around the table, we nominate the First and Deputy First Minister, that we ensure that we have a 3-year budget, and crucially, we ensure that the more than £300 million that we have not been able to spend for the want of an executive, that we sort that out and we get that money into people's pockets as soon as possible. And I hope the DUP have really listened to people on the ground when they have told them that they are struggling from day to day just to make ends meet. And any delay, be very sure, any delay will be greeted with dismay and anger by the wide general public.
When I spoke to Edwin Poots of the DUP earlier, who was briefly party leader for a period, he said that votes going to traditional unionist Voice, another anti-protocol party, was a sign that unionism was hardening around that position, and for that reason they would not be returning to the executive. I mentioned dysfunction a moment ago. Isn't that a sign of democracy not working and democracy not functioning in Northern Ireland?
But you see, democracy has to work, and the opinion polling prior to this election campaign and the results of this election campaign in the round have demonstrated, firstly, that the issues around the protocol, yes, are a concern for a section of political unionism, but it is by no means the dominant issue in politics here. And secondly, there is a huge pro-protocol sentiment right across the north. So the DUP can have their view, the DUP can take their political stance, but they can't have everything their own way, and they cannot insist that because their view is not the predominant view that they're going to hold up the whole show. And by the way, the issues on the protocol are not insurmountable. If the British government acts in good faith with our European partners, they can sort these matters out. The Assembly has no prerogative in that regard.
What about the centre ground? Another big story of this election, the Alliance Party, the Cross-Community Alliance Party, doing very well. Now, your party colleague Jerry Kelly said to me earlier that the Good Friday Agreement, which sets up this finely balanced arrangement between unionism and nationalism, is a bespoke agreement. It can't easily be unpicked. But where once in Northern Ireland people were, put in boxes, weren't they, green or orange, nationalist or unionist, we now have this large centre groundswell of voting. So does the arrangement at Stormont need to be reconfigured to take account of that?
Well, look, I mean, the current arrangements mean and have meant that the Alliance Party sat at the executive table, and rightly so, claiming their position to represent their constituency. So I don't accept that they are excluded from the arrangements. Indeed, whoever the largest party is, be it Alliance or Sinn Féin or anyone else, has the right and prerogative to nominate the First Minister. But let me make this point, whatever about what might happen in the future, all of us need to understand that we fought this election on the basis of the agreed rule book that we have now. And the first challenge for all of us is to conform to those rules and norms, to be respectful to each other and to actually crack on and to form an executive.
I just want to finally ask you, what is your time frame for a potential border poll on a united Ireland? This is not something that Sinn Féin mentioned during the campaign. Indeed, it was the Democratic Unionist Party who mentioned this more than Sinn Féin. But clearly there is an anxiety amongst unionists about that. So what is your time frame for a border poll?
Well, my first time frame is this, that preparation for orderly, peaceful, democratic transition needs to start now. And I've made that case very strongly to the government in Dublin in particular. That needs to be an inclusive process, and there's no time to be left.
What does that mean?
It means the formation of a citizens' assembly, north and south, to bring all of the stakeholders together, including the political parties, but not just the political parties, to talk about health and education and to talk about the future that we need to build together. On the issue of the referendums themselves, they're provided for in the Good Friday Agreement, which will be 25 years old next year. We are going to have these referendums in the coming years. Do you have
a time frame for a vote?
I believe these votes will happen certainly within this decade, and I believe within the next 5 years. That's my view, but I also know we need to prepare now for that orderly, peaceful, democratic change.
Mary Lou McDonald, leader of Sinn Féin, thank you very much for your time. And I think it's fair to say that quite a few people have observed that were it to come to a border poll, it's actually those middle ground voters who are made up of people from all sorts of religious backgrounds and who in their families may have traditional nationalist or unionist backgrounds, but perhaps their views have changed to move towards the centre ground. It's those sorts of people who ultimately will be the ones deciding, because they are going to sway a border poll vote if it happens one way or the other, which is a very interesting point to end that interview on. Huw, back to you.
Indeed, Anita, thanks very much. Anita McVeigh there, and we'll be back with Anita given that those results are still coming in Belfast. So what we'd like to do now is just, let's widen the context. We've looked at Northern Ireland there. Let's get right up to date on the state of the parties now this evening. And to look maybe at some of the notable losses and gains. So let's join Rita to have a look at that first.
Huw, I'm going to take you through results from England, Scotland and Wales, but this screen is about England only. Only 4 more councils left to declare, so we're nearly there now. It's been a long night, hasn't it, and a long day. We are nearly there. As you can see, Labour has picked up 53 councillors. It's gone forward, but presumably not nearly as much as it would have wanted to. The Conservatives have had a bad night of it. They've lost over 300 councillors, and that's just in England. The Lib Dems, by contrast, have put in a very healthy performance, gaining 187. And the Greens too. Let's put in a word for the Greens, because they've actually gained more councillors than Labour have. So, really good performance by them. Let's look at some of the actual council results, starting with Wales. And Bridgend, you can see, is a Labour gain. Bridgend, let me just bring up the details for you. So this is in South Wales. It's a Labour gain. They have a majority of 3 seats. And what's interesting here is to show you how much Labour has gone forward. Look at that, up by 10 seats. Independents also gaining 6 seats, and that's at the expense of mainly the Conservatives, but of Plaid and the Liberal Democrats too. Cardiff is a Labour hold, but that's also interesting to look at, just in terms of an emerging story of Labour doing well in Wales overnight. So they've got a great big majority here in Cardiff of 31 seats. And last time round, it was the Conservatives who gained 10 seats in 2017, even though it was a Labour council still. And look at that, they've gained 13 seats in Cardiff. And the comparison with the Conservative performance of losing 11. So they will not be unhappy with their performance there. In Monmouthshire, the Conservatives have lost control of that council and it's now a hung council. Plaid have picked up 3 councils. They've gained 3 councils, Carmarthenshire and also Anglesey and Ceredigion. Moving to England, Harrow is, I've described it as the one silver lining in an otherwise rather dark cloud for the Conservatives in London, because they lost Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, but they have gained Harrow, so that is, they'll be certainly rather relieved at that. The Lib Dems, on a very good night for them, have gained Gosport in Hampshire from the Conservatives, and they've gained Woking from no overall control, Woking in Surrey. And the SNP once again tops the poll in Scotland. They are preeminent and they have gained Dundee from no overall control. If you are wondering what has happened in your own area, please do go to the BBC News website, enter your postcode and your area will come up. So that's on the website and it's also on the BBC News app.
Rita, thank you very much. Well, there were some interesting results there to reflect on, and the guests and me here were just having a look at one or two of them, wondering what prompted this or what prompted that, and we can try to unpick some of them. Alison, Christopher, good to have you with us. Thank you very much. I suppose the best thing to do, and so that we're all together with viewers and going one direction in the conversation, can we take party by party, leader by leader, party by party? Let's start with the Conservatives then. And I'll start with you then, with this one, Christopher. We started the day thinking, oh, you know, it's not been great for the Tories in London. Bit of a surprise they lost Westminster. Wandsworth maybe wasn't quite so much of a surprise. Barnet certainly was a good win for Labour. But outside London, as the wisdom went earlier, it's not too bad for the Conservatives. As we've got to this stage of the day, it looks rather worse, and some of the results there will tell their own story. Lib Dems in the south, Labour in other parts. How do you rate the Tory performance?
It's so-so. It's not a disaster, which was certainly what a lot of Tory MPs were fearing, and we thought it might be going to a massive weekend of Tory leadership speculation. And Boris Johnson was the Carlsberg, or if I can use a brand name on the BBC. He reached parts of the country other MPs, leaders couldn't reach, and that he's more like an own brand lager now. He's less popular, I think, in some parts, and that's the problem he's got. You saw there Bridgend, other seats that he won in 2019. Yeah. The Red Wall seat is not crumbling, but it's being chipped away, and that's a worry, I think. And also there's pressure on him in the southwest, don't forget, Somerset. Yeah. A lot of MPs lost there. I've been talking to Marcus Fish, the MP for Yeovil tonight. He's really upset and they want a change in economic direction. There's pressure from all sides. He's just looking a bit more battered, I think. It wasn't the disaster though that could have happened.
Is he, in terms of his own position, significantly less secure now or not?
People who write letters to him, these 54 no confidence letters must be sent in to Graham Brady. They say he is less secure. The ones I've spoken to have sent them in, but there's no real bandwagon behind that to put them in. But there's certainly leadership is in the air. We know there might be big issues next week. I think that, I think the Tory party feels to me it needs to have a vote of confidence in Johnson just to get past the Partygate stuff, because that hangs over him. That annoyed. I was in Wandsworth last week. Lots of Tory MPs saying, we might just vote for him this time because of bins and because of potholes and low council tax, but the general election, no chance. I think somehow he's got to meet a reckoning with his own MPs and membership on the issue of Partygate. He hasn't done it yet.
Is that doable, Alison?
Well, I mean, a lot of the people that have been speaking today, local councillors, have been really quite angry that they felt that they were having to have those arguments on doorsteps with people who were angry about Partygate. I mean, I thought Cumberland was an interesting one this morning. So, I mean, obviously there were the big London ones, which we'd sort of, to an extent, expected, hadn't we? But, I mean, it's still doesn't detract from the idea of Westminster and Barnet. And, you know, I know it happened a few hours ago now, but they're still big stories. Yeah. But I think what's interesting is then you have things that are out of London, which is this idea that, oh, maybe he was safer outside London. I thought Cumberland was a really interesting one. And the Carlisle City councillor was on this morning, and he was absolutely furious, really, that he'd had to go out there and defend things that he felt were indefensible. So I think there's more of that around. I think that would be a big call if it was to be a vote of confidence, because I'm not, you know, we don't quite know how that would finish. So, and how much below the surface, and it's like he's sort of under attack from all directions from those red wall seats, where you're going to have MPs there that have got not huge majorities and are now going to be feeling sort of quite uncomfortable about what the next 2 years could bring, could get an awful lot worse. And then, of course, you've got the blue wall, so to speak, or all those other towns where, again, there's people who, A, they're feeling uncomfortable about their own positions, and B, they're a bit cross.
It's interesting as well to see where the Lib Dems have popped up in pretty confident style and really made inroads in some of the areas you mentioned. Somebody mentioned Somerset, I think, earlier, which is that new authority, of course, which was a whopping great victory for Ed Davey. And then, of course, we've seen in other parts, Labour holding up better than some people thought in areas where they were kind of, as we say, fighting against the Tories. Now, does this mean, and I'm going to ask this to both of you, does this mean that from Labour's point of view, it would be better for them maybe not to have such a go at Boris Johnson and to hope that he remains in place? Yeah. And does it mean, and I'll ask the question a different way to you, Christopher, which is that these Tory MPs who may be a little nervous, it's one heck of a gamble to start going after a leader who, all right, may be proving to be unpopular with parts of the electorate, but goodness me, you've no idea where an election for leader will take you. Yeah, so it's the gamble element. First of all, is he an asset to Labour?
I think he is at the moment, yes. And because I think that's what it's shown here. The Liberal Democrats have benefited hugely from the frailties around Boris Johnson. And then I think the next step, obviously, is the cost of living crisis is only really in the foothills. So I think when people are actually feeling that much more, when we go into the autumn, when not only are the bills going to have gone up, further energy bills, it's also going to be cold.
Yeah.
Those numbers from the Bank of England yesterday. So that is only going to get worse. So I think it's going to be tough for Boris Johnson.
They're not going to gamble it, are they? Surely.
It takes 3 months to get a new leader. I mean, Tory strategists are saying to advisors in Number 10, shut your eyes and imagine someone else who isn't Boris Johnson getting off a bus in Bridgend. Would you be happy campaigning for that person? When you're out with Boris Johnson, love him or not like him, he is a rock star politician who does trying to get people going. He does inspire. He's got weaknesses. We know about them. When he came in, he had those weaknesses. He still got them. I think there's a need to almost like to reassert your vows for Boris Johnson.
Totally. Although
on the backbenches.
Yeah, but those Bridgend figures are interesting. Yeah. That he was a rock star getting off a bus in Bridgend for a while. Yeah. But every rock star has their day, don't they? And maybe it has passed.
You've got to play on the back catalogue. I mean, in London, certainly, I think those 19 Tory MPs, not Boris Johnson, they'll be looking, saying, this city's gone Labour. Is he the right leader for us? That's a whole new cohort of people who might put letters in, I think.
Rock star politician. According to some of the people we spoke to overnight, Alison, Keir Starmer's problem is that he's not a rock star politician. Somebody said, a bit bland. Other people, and the Labour people as well including, said he seems a bit weak. I mean, he may not be weak, but he seems a bit weak. And was not seen to be enthusing people in a way that the party needed, and that these results were okay. John Curtis said, I think early this morning, they're not spectacular results for Labour at all. And on the basis of the projected national share, it's certainly not translating into what would be a general election win. Biggest party in Parliament, but not a win. Is that lack of a rock star, alleged lack of rock star quality, actually a virtue these days?
Well, I think that was obviously what Keir Starmer was hoping, that he was the perfect antidote to Boris Johnson. And I think we've got to put it into a bit of context that when we came out of the 2019 election, it appeared that Labour were in an absolutely horrendous position that it was going to probably take 10 years to come back from. So that was the starting point. And I think the first 2 years, Keir Starmer spent quite a lot of time trying to get his house in order. I mean, it was only the last party conference that it spent most of the time sort of faffing around on internal rule changes. So there's been a bit of a, so maybe this is, maybe this is the plan. 2 years sorting your house out. Then, of course, obviously we've had COVID, then we had the Partygate, then we've had Ukraine. So he's had a lot of things coming up from different directions. But maybe if the next 2 years is then, right, this is the real Keir Starmer, this is the policies, this is the pizzazz, this is the... That's, I think, perhaps what he is going to have to bring a bit more of that out. That is what certainly our readers are looking for, right? We think he's great, we think he's solid, we think he's sensible, but let's have a little bit of oomph now.
Let's turn the question I asked earlier about whether Johnson is an asset to Labour and ask, is Keir Starmer seen as an asset to the Tories?
Well, he is, according to Tory people I speak to. They think he's not very political. I think he went too hard on your Partygate story, saying resign to Rishi Sunak and to Boris Johnson, when he may have known that there was question marks about his own drinking a beer in a surgery in Durham in an office with an MP.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's went too hard on Partygate, and now he's got to work out where he goes next with that. He's not answering any of your questions when he's spotted around the country today about whether he's going to resign if he gets a fine. That's the big issue he's got. I think he's making good tax on Johnson over tax. I think he's saying, I would cut taxes for people on low wages, which is what, of course, the Nix increase hasn't done. So I think he's navigating around Johnson. He's got a good team around him from the Blair years, really, but they kind of want to be in power. They know that's the point of being politics, isn't it?
But I mean, yes, and you think for an opposition party to be against the government where government's qualities have been called into question, integrity and trust and honesty, which are, let's face it, pretty big concepts to be called into question. And then, of course, you have a cost of living crisis, you have inflation heading for 10%, possible inflation around the corner, people saying very openly that the help that's on offer so far with household bills, especially, is not enough. There is help there, but it's not enough. An opposition party should be in a position to capitalise more on that.
Well,
are we saying that? Yes.
It's not the mid-90s, is it? I mean, he is not Tony Blair. When Tony Blair was really on the charge in 95, 96, ahead of the landslide in 97, that's not happening.
But I do think we have to remember he was coming from a very poor, very, very difficult position in 2019.
Yes.
And he has made some headway, but, I mean, like you say, there's been some big stories this year for him to capitalise on.
Can we just take a pause? I want to talk about Lib Dems, I want to talk about Greens, and you're with us for a while yet, so let's share out the riches, shall we? So thank you both for now. Let's catch up with the rest of the day's news. Sean, hi there.
Hello to you, thank you very much. Now, if you want to find out the election results in your area, just head to the BBC News website or BBC News app, where you can enter your postcode. There's also lots of election analysis and the latest reports from our teams covering the counts around the UK. Now back to elections 2022.
Welcome back, and thanks to Sean for the latest on the news there. Can I show you this result from St Albans, which is in Hertfordshire, because this will tell us something about the story of the day as well. So the Lib Dems, it's a very big Lib Dem stronghold, this part of England. So St Albans has been held by the Lib Dems. That's no surprise, because the Lib Dems have had a very good local election. But let's look at the actual result. 50 seats to the Lib Dems in St Albans. And as we will see in a second, that's a dramatic improvement on their position. 4 seats to the Tories, and then the Independents and Greens on 1 apiece. Now let's look at the change since last time round. Look at that. Now, that is what you call a kind of turbocharged boost there by the Lib Dems, putting on 20 seats in St Albans. And look at that Conservative performance, down 18 seats in a part of the country that, yes, of course, it's quite affluent. It's quite a Remain kind of part of the world. So you've got to build that in as well. In terms of the kind of demographic nature of it. But that is still a startling result for the Tories, where they've been, I hope I'm excused for using the word, they've been walloped there, haven't they, really, in St Albans. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to talk to Paul Bartrop, who's our regional political editor in the west of England, in Bristol. That's because we're still on a Lib Dem theme. And Paul, I want to ask you about the performance of the Lib Dems in your region, and specifically in Somerset, in that new authority which we were talking about earlier today, because there again, it was a very strong Lib Dem performance. Talk us through that.
Well, it surpassed all expectations. It surpassed all predictions. the Conservatives had run the county of Somerset at county council level for 13 years. The last time it was up was 2017, and they got a big, solid majority back then. Now, back in 2019, the most recent local elections for the county was when the districts went to the polls. People would remember that was a bad year for Theresa May, a bad year for the Conservatives in the local elections. And in that particular instance, the Liberal Democrats took 3 of the 4 district councils. So they were going well then, but obviously we then had a general election months later. The Lib Dems didn't do well at all. And it's a county where once they were so strong, you think back to the Paddy Ashdown era. You think back to those times when they held most of the parliamentary seats in Somerset. They did really well across the West Country. That all hit the buffers back in 2005 at the end of the coalition. They were wiped off the electoral map in terms of parliamentary seats in the West Country. And so they'd be looking for their way back. Now, this election, they went into it a long way behind the Conservatives in terms of the county-wide vote last time. They hoped to make real progress. They thought they might end up as the biggest party, but what they actually got was a big, solid majority. The Tories were really thumped across the county. It was a bad result for them. And it has to be said, if you look at the other parties, Labour, very small in Somerset, pretty much stayed where they were. There are just a handful of Green councillors, no real change there. There's a few independents, again, no real change. It was the Lib Dems going forward, the Conservatives going backwards very badly.
So the question then, Paul, is how concerned are Conservatives in the west of England about the prospects in a general election faced with a resurgent Lib Dem party? What are they saying to you?
It was interesting. I was talking to one Somerset Conservative MP yesterday who was saying, look, on the one hand, 5 years ago, yes, we did really well in local elections here. But then he said 3 years ago, we had a pretty dire night. And he was saying, yeah, we can expect these ups and downs, putting it down to a bit of midterm blues. But that was before the results came in. I don't think he was expecting, I don't think any of the Conservatives in Somerset were expecting it to be as bad as it really was. So they will be worried because it's this, this sense of the Lib Dem resurgence against the Conservatives. Whilst elsewhere in the West Country, the Conservatives have held their ground to quite a degree against Labour. They really have gone backwards where they're up against the Lib Dems. That will put the frighteners on them there. If you look up the road, actually go up the M5 to Cheltenham, where half the seats were being contested on the council there. The Lib Dems already ran that council. But what we saw today was the Conservatives slipping backwards even more. And that will be a real concern to the Conservative MP there, who sits on a very marginal majority indeed. I would say for Conservative MPs, it's a real worry. Some of them will try to say this is just, a midterm ripple, if you like. Bit of people expressing their discontent. And I know when I was out in Somerset in recent times talking to people, I met quite a few who said, yes, I would normally vote Conservative, but because of what's been going on nationally, I'm not going to this time.
Paul, good to talk to you as always. Thanks very much. Paul Bartrop there talking about the Somerset result and indeed looking across the west of England at the Lib Dem performance there and following on from what I was saying about St Albans. Christopher, I know that you know the St Albans area pretty well, but some of these lessons are quite common, aren't they? The West Country in many ways offers some useful parallels for us. How concerned should Conservative MPs be about the Lib Dem threat in these parts of the world?
Very. The land grab that Boris Johnson's been doing in the north and the Red Wall, those kind of seats, and Wales and elsewhere, as the concern is the seats in the core grassroots part of the country where the Tories have been so strong are being forgotten about. The St Albans is also a Remain story, I think. They've certainly Daisy Cooper there, a great MP, the Lib Dem deputy leader, has built a real strong team there of campaigners, and I think they're doing really well. Somerset's a worry. I've been talking to Marcus Fish, as I said earlier, the MP for Yeovil. He's now calling tonight for a change in economic strategy. He's not sure. He's not sure about personalities, but he thinks that the policy is wrong on taxation. And that area, I think, that's where the new headache for Boris Johnson going into the new parliamentary term next week is: what are we doing here? We are losing sight of these core areas we've relied on for so long.
Time and again, overnight, talking to Conservatives who were feeling the pain.
Yeah.
And even earlier today, I think we were talking to Ian Duncan-Smith earlier. Same kind of message. There needs to be more help for people. Taxation policy is wrong. National insurance policy is misguided. If there is to be extra help, it needs to be now, not waiting for the budget. There's no kind of time to lose, especially given the fact that people are now signalling, it's a bit of a crisis going on. So, first of all, I mean, you kick off with this one, Christopher, and then I'll come to Alison. Is that likely? We've had Rishi Sunak saying it would be silly to start offering more help now before we know what's going to happen in the autumn. He explained that very clearly, and his thinking was very clear on that. Is he going to have to revisit that decision?
Well, the budget in November is after the huge increase likely in energy prices in the 1st of October. And that figure is set in August. The hot money is on some form of intervention, fiscal intervention by the government in September, looking into the party conference season. There's no way that the Tories will go through all the party conferences of the Lib Dems and Labour and have no answer to the huge increase in energy prices in October. Going back from that point, looking at a reshuffle in September, looking at 3 difficult elections for by-elections for different reasons. There's all sorts of new lines in the sand, but I do think some Tory MPs feel there's a need to try and work renew the vows with their leader, and that can't come soon enough. But the pressure from a slimmed down Ed Davey, lost 2 stone, fighting fit, looking punchy, looking sharp. I think he's an interesting threat, I think, for the Tories that they were disregarding a few months ago, but not anymore.
Well, if they did underestimate, they've done it at their cost, haven't they, really? Because were you expecting to see the Lib Dems coming back at this kind of strength?
I think throughout the Lib Dems' history, they've always been there as a place for people to go to when they're dissatisfied with the other 2 options. So that's always there. But I mean, certainly they probably have exceeded even perhaps their own expectations on this occasion. And it's a long way for people who are very, very cross perhaps with the Conservatives to go all the way to Labour, even at this point. And I think, as we've said as well, the hangover of Brexit still lingers, and we know that a lot of those, so St Albans, for example, and for a lot of other Remain areas, that's where the Conservatives have got difficulties, and so the Lib Dems is there as an opportunity. So I think that's interesting. I think there's also this issue that Boris Johnson is really facing now with the Conservative Party's difficulty in appealing to sort of a lot of their old guard. I mean, so this idea that sort of more people who may have left school at 18 are now more likely to vote Conservative than people at degree level, they're maybe more going to Labour, which feels like some of the old ideas have been turned upside down. And, sometimes for want of a better word, Boris Johnson is really failing in posh areas, really. And they're going to the Lib Dems. And there is, I think, unless something significant changes, and perhaps September is too long away, it's going to be really quite difficult, because if there isn't interventions before September and then there's more party fines, is that momentum that we've seen earlier in the year only going to gather more speed?
It was interesting. We talked to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury during the afternoon, and I put this to him several times, and he was quite consistent as well in saying there are concerns about public finances. We can't be making decisions to commit more money when we've got lots of debt to pay off. We don't know what the circumstances will be in the autumn. We don't want to commit ourselves to measures now where we may have to add even more measures in the autumn. So he's making a very rational, measured case. But the case was very clear. He clearly is against making some kind of move pretty soon. Yes? He wants to wait. He wants to wait to see what's going on. Very much the Rishi Sunak line. I'm wondering at what point the Downing Street line begins to cut across that.
But I thought Boris Johnson was interviewed this afternoon, wasn't he, when he was painting those pictures for the children. And he was pushed, I think, in that direction. And that would have been an opportunity to dangle a carrot if something was coming. But it really didn't seem to be there. So.
And last week, Rishi Sunak pushed the idea of a windfall tax, and no one then denied it, and that is definitely in the ether. That is, they're not sure where to go on it next. The price rise in October is set in August, so this is what I think it was Simon Clarke talking to. Didn't want to go ahead of August. So I think, but more signalling. Certainly, Boris Johnson was keen to signal something in the spring statement, and Rishi Sunak said no. So that this tension is always there between Chancellor and Prime Minister could get worse.
Let's have a look at the South East. We talked about the West Country there. We were talking about the Lib Dems' strength. The performance in the South East of England, 29 out of 29 councils declared. So the full house for you. And in terms of councillors, Labour on 147, having added 19. Look at the Conservative losses. They're down 85 in the South East of England. The Lib Dems are up 42. The Independents up 6. The Greens up 16. The Residents' Associations up 2. Councils themselves. Let's have a look at council control, the all-important thing. The Tories on 8, having lost control of 5 councils in the South East, which is a pretty chunky loss. Labour on 6, having gained 2. The Lib Dems on 5, having gained 2. And then the Independents and Greens not controlling any. And 10 hung councils, one more than there used to be. So I'm going to call in Charlotte Wright, who's my colleague in BBC South East in Tunbridge Wells. Charlotte, thanks for joining us. So bring us up to date with the overview in your region and the relative strengths there of the Tories and Labour and the Lib Dems.
Well, it was clearly a very difficult set of results for the Conservatives. I mean, they took a bit of a beating, really, particularly in places like Tunbridge Wells, for example, you know, once that was considered the sort of Tory heartlands, and they lost control of the council. Well, they lost control of the council last year, actually, but they became the second party this year. So the Lib Dems became the biggest party. They also lost seats in Tandridge as well, and of course lost Worthing Council to Labour. So it's been really difficult for the Conservatives, this set of results. I think when we look at places like Tunbridge Wells, I do think Partygate clearly has played a part in people's decision making. You know, when you go out and about and speak to people in Tunbridge Wells, they do raise it, they do talk about it. Some of the activists that I've spoken to as well say it came up quite a lot on the doorstep. And of course, Tunbridge Wells is the only area in Kent that voted Remain. They're not necessarily massive fans of Boris Johnson, and I think are possibly a little less forgiving of him than maybe some other parts of the country. So the Conservatives really took a hit in places like Tunbridge Wells. It is worth bearing in mind, though, that the results that we've seen in the South East do seem to have, in some places, followed a bit of a pattern. I mean, Tandridge lost, the Conservatives lost overall control of the council back in 2019, and they continued to lose seats this time around. And Tunbridge Wells, as I mentioned, you know, the Conservatives lost overall control of the council last year. So we can't put everything at the door of Partygate and the current national political situation. And of course, many people have been voting on local issues as well. You know, the state of their roads, housing is a really big issue in the South East as well. But yeah, certainly a really difficult set of results for the Conservatives here.
Charlotte, good to talk to you, and thank you very much for the update. Charlotte Wright there at the BBC newsroom in Tunbridge Wells, looking at Kent and the South East. Christopher Hope and Alison Phillips, I'm really grateful to both of you.
Thank you.
It's been very nice to have your company. You can come again.
Thank you.
Yes.
We will.
I'm going to let you go, and hopefully you'll have a nice evening.
Thank you.
But plenty for us to discuss, and I'll be looking forward to reading what you're going to include in your publications on the results as well. But thanks very much for being with us. And why don't we catch up with the weather? And it's Thomas tonight. Hi, Thomas. How are you?
Good evening.
Warm welcome back to the BBC's election studio at New Broadcasting House in London. This has been our home nearly for 24 hours now, monitoring all the election results as they come in. Most of them have come in. We've been looking in detail at some of the English council election results, which have taught us quite a great deal about the various related positions of the parties in England at the moment. The Wales results, most of them in, showing slightly different pattern in the sense that Labour is still all-powerful in Wales, the Conservatives having a really tough time there. In Scotland, of course, the SNP still all-powerful, but Labour having moved into second place ahead of the Conservatives. And in Northern Ireland, lots of the results still to come. But Sinn Féin have made history in Northern Ireland because they're at the top of the poll. I haven't got all the results in, so we can't start drawing some firm conclusions about what the future brings in Northern Ireland in terms of the next few days and weeks, but we'll be talking a little more about that in a moment. With me in the studio, a new guest, and it is John Stevens of the Daily Mail. Thanks for coming in, John. and we'll talk to John in a second. And we'll also be joined by Nancy Fielder, the editor of the Sheffield Star. Nancy, nice to have you with us as well, and we'll be chatting to you in a moment too. So let's just pause there for a second, catch up with the day's news with Sean, and then we'll be back to talk a little more about the results. Hi, Sean.
Good evening again to you, Huw. Here is a summary of the other stories this evening. The Prime Minister says it's been a tough set of the elections for the Conservative Party. It lost hundreds of seats. Labour took some of the Tories' flagship councils in London, but made few significant gains elsewhere. It was a good night all round for the Liberal Democrats and for the Green Party. In Scotland, the SNP has once again finished as the biggest party. Labour has come second. The Conservatives, though, suffered heavy losses. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, whose report does contain some flashing images.
OK, folks, this is going well.
Trademark optimism, despite shedding councils and losing nearly 400 councillors too. But in the safety of a primary school classroom in his constituency, the Prime Minister didn't seem downcast.
That's very good, that blue margin there you've done. What about some sort of baubles here?
He lost iconic London councils, giving away comfortable Conservative ground.
And what are we going to have when we have the party?
Yet anger at Downing Street parties and his fine for breaking the law
There you go.
did not translate into the catastrophe some Conservatives had feared.
It's mid-term and it's certainly a mixed set of results, and we've had a tough night in some parts of the country, but on the other hand, in other parts of the country, you're still seeing Conservatives going forward and making quite remarkable gains in places that haven't voted Conservative for a long time, or if ever.
Not in London, where his Labour rival had big reasons to smile this morning, winning over territory held by the Tories for decades.
We've just done it! Yes! Westminster! Yes! Wandsworth!
Steps forward, but outside London, perhaps not big, bold strides Labour needs.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Have you heard from Durham Police, Sir Keir? Any comment on their investigation?
Yet as he travelled to celebrate success elsewhere, allegations over lockdown chased the Labour leader. Durham Police will now investigate claims that Keir Starmer broke the rules, having beer and curry with colleagues during lockdown.
Anything to say about the investigation, Sir Keir? Have you heard from Durham Police?
He's always said nothing went wrong, but they are questions Keir Starmer will have to answer. Voters' response to the Lib Dems was warm in many places, grabbing seats from Labour in the northern city Hull, from the Tories in Kent, Tunbridge Wells, Somerset and pockets of affluent London. The message to the Tories from some green suburbs will cause Tory nerves.
They're saying they've had enough of this Prime Minister. And I think the tectonic plates of British politics are shifting. And now it's up to Conservative MPs to shove the Prime Minister into the abyss.
Remember, your votes stitch together a giant patchwork, not a picture that's the same in every corner of the country.
You're my mum's counsellor, yeah?
There was striking Labour success in London that will hurt for the Tories, who broadly fell back further in the south than in the north of England, their coalition fraying more at its traditional end. But Labour's jubilation in the capital wasn't always matched by enthusiasm elsewhere. The Greens picking up pace too, with dozens of gains. But while results in England perhaps confirmed much of the status quo, the scene is set for a genuine moment of change in Northern Ireland. Look at this. For the first time, voters seem poised to make Sinn Féin the biggest party. That would be a moment of history and a moment of challenge and uncertainty for the UK.
I'm very grateful for all those people that came out and engaged in what was a very positive campaign.
Leaders whose dream is leaving the Union for a united Ireland would be in charge. Yay! And that could also shift the political conversation in Scotland, where the SNP, who also want to leave the UK, continue their years of dominance. Crucially, Labour moves up into second place. The Scottish Tories in a slump. And grew in Wales too, the biggest party profiting at the expense of the Tories.
Yet, spin back a few weeks, many Tories in there feared a complete calamity. They've had a terrible time in some parts of the country, but this hasn't been a wipeout. And Labour has moved forward, but not far or fast enough to be sure of power. Remember, these elections give us clues, not concrete convictions of what's coming next. But it seems the two big parties are somehow locked in an uncomfortable status quo.
That is very good.
No dramatic breakthrough for his main rival, no total breakdown for the Conservatives. Boris Johnson has taken knocks today, but still stands to carry on. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
As Laura was reporting there, police in Durham are investigating whether the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, broke lockdown rules on a visit during which he drank beer in an MP's office. The force initially decided that no offence had occurred in April last year, but said it had since received significant new information. Here's what Mr. Sir Keir had to say on the matter this evening.
As I've explained a number of times, we were working in the office, we stopped for something to eat, no party, no breach of the rules. The police obviously have got their job to do, we should let them get on with it, but I'm confident that no rules were broken. Meanwhile, we've had a really good set of results today.
The SNP has emerged as the winner of the elections in Scotland. Labour has overtaken the Conservatives to become the second largest party. That's for the first time in 6 years. With all results now declared, the SNP has gained 23 seats. Labour has added 19. The Conservatives lost 62 of their councillors. In Wales, Labour made gains while the Conservatives suffered significant losses. The latest results show Labour gaining 50 seats and control of 6 councils. Plaid Cymru, the party of Wales, has gained 3 seats and now oversees 2 councils. In Northern Ireland, as Laura reported, Sinn Féin is on course for its best ever result. In the Northern Ireland Assembly election, it received the most first preference votes. With counting for the 90 Stormont Assembly seats continuing tonight, the party has so far won 16 seats, well ahead of the Alliance, who are on 4, and the DUP and Ulster Unionist Party, both of which have 3. If you want to find out the election results in your area, head to the BBC News website or use the BBC News app. You just have to enter your postcode and the results will appear. You'll also find plenty of election analysis and the very latest reports from our teams across the UK at the different counts. Now though, let's go back to Huw and elections 2022.
Many thanks to Sean, and we'll be back for some more news a little later on. So we're going to catch up now with the latest on the state of play in Northern Ireland, where lots of the results are still to be declared, and they'll go through to tomorrow. We had a note from the Electoral Commission there just a short while ago to say that there was a lot of work still to do in terms of verifying votes and then processing the actual counting of the votes there as well. And for that reason, we won't get the completed list in Northern Ireland until tomorrow. So we'll do that. We've logged that fact, but we can still talk about the fact that as things stand, Sinn Féin, for the first time, are topping the poll in Northern Ireland on 29% of those first preference votes. And then we can also note then that the Alliance Party is in third. That's the party that is not taking any kind of stance on the constitutional framework and structure of Northern Ireland. It takes a neutral stance on that. The DUP, traditionally the most powerful grouping of unionists, is in second place now, pushed into second by Sinn Féin. So already we can say that the election in Northern Ireland has broken new ground. But as I say, it's quite a distance to go yet, with just 29 of 90 seats declared. So let's go straight to Belfast and join Anita for some more conversation there.
Thank you very much. Yes, Huw. And as you were saying, the counting of the votes going, I think it's safe to say, not as speedily as the Chief Electoral Officer would have liked. Last time I looked just a few seconds ago, we hadn't reached the 30 mark. That would be a third of the 90 seats. So we're not quite at the 30 mark yet. So still a way to go, as you were reflecting, and the counts in the 3 centres here in Northern Ireland moving into a second day. But as the polls have suggested, it does look as though Sinn Féin, the Nationalist Party that wants to see a united Ireland, will emerge as the biggest party in this election. And joining me now to discuss that and other aspects of this election is the DUP MP Gavin Robinson. Thank you very much for your time today. So if Sinn Féin, as predictions suggest, do emerge as the biggest party, that's obviously hugely symbolic for nationalism. How does that make you feel as a unionist? Would it make you feel uncomfortable?
Well, I think, as you know, politics is in a difficult position in Northern Ireland, and it's really been infected by the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that's had a significant impact on political stability here. So one of the big challenges after this election, irrespective of the result, is how do we get a firm foundation for our political institutions at Stormont. That's where the focus is going to have to be in the immediate term. Prior to the establishment of any executive, we're going to have to see movement that allows us to rebuild the institutions in a way that is beneficial for all communities in Northern Ireland. So that's challenge one. Challenge two, of course, is also to recognise that our system cannot operate unless you have support from both of the traditional communities in Northern Ireland. So that means there can be no executive without Sinn Féin or the DUP, and that is right, irrespective of the result today as well.
And that is the very essence of the power sharing arrangement that was set up under the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement. But unionists have held that position of First Minister since then. If this was the first time that Sinn Féin was in the position to be First Minister, to come back to my initial question, how uncomfortable would that be for unionism, do you think?
Well, I don't think that today's results are anything that I'm going to celebrate or jump for joy over. I know that we have had a difficult day in some seats, but I think some of the doom predicted for democratic unionism, or indeed unionism as a whole, has not come to pass today. You can see that there has been a consolidation and a growth of the centre, and you can see that the SDLP and the Ulster Unionists have both been squeezed today alongside a number of seats that we had. That we're in a difficult place, but we are still having a good showing, and as you know, and you mentioned earlier, this is a marathon, not a sprint, so it's going to take until tomorrow till we see exactly where all the seats fall.
On that functioning of the executive, now when I was talking to voters through the day on Tuesday in Antrim, all of them, irrespective of what their political tradition was, said to me that they wanted to see the government working, the power sharing executive functioning, making decisions to help to try to ease the cost of living crisis, to deal with healthcare. Those were the two biggest issues that were mentioned to me. Now, your party leader, Sir Jeffrey Donaldson, has said to RTE that the DUP will not join a power-sharing government led by a Sinn Féin First Minister if the British government and the European Union have not secured a breakthrough in post-Brexit trade talks. So that has to come first. Is that the bottom line for the DUP, or is there any possibility that you would re-enter the power-sharing executive and work towards an accommodation on the protocol?
But that's the point that I was making. We need to have firm foundations for political stability in Northern Ireland. The protocol has shattered stability in this province.
So you're saying
the Good Friday Agreement
saying the protocol has undermined the foundations of the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, it has. And of course the whole essence of it was supposed to protect the Good Friday Agreement, but it shatters East-West relations. There's one strand. North-South relations haven't been working. There's a second strand, and the executive hasn't functioned either. There's the third strand. If you snap one strand, the others will start to fray. They have frayed, and they need to be fixed.
But so can you properly deliver, sorry to interrupt, but can you properly deliver on those bread and butter issues, cost of living, healthcare and so on, unless you're in a functioning executive? Are all those decisions surely not put on hold if you're waiting to sort out the protocol first?
You need to dial it back. You can't do anything about VAT on electricity costs in Northern Ireland as you can in England and Wales. Why? Because the protocol and the European Commission rules that we remain under. We're electing people today to an assembly that has no say whatsoever in the rules and the laws that affect trade in this province. You can't deal with them in Westminster, and if a vote was to happen in Stormont, it wouldn't matter because there's a democratic deficit at the heart of the protocol as well. It's European Union that makes those rules that apply to us and not Westminster or Stormont. So you're talking about an executive that has no power to deal with the cost of living crisis, to take measures from Westminster on VAT, on electricity and costs and so on. So we need to deal with the fundamentals first.
Do you
and
regret?
Then we can sort out things for people in Northern Ireland.
Do you regret the DUP's position on Brexit, its support for Brexit, your relationship with the Conservative government, Theresa May, and then Boris Johnson? Because
regret exactly that the Conservative government delivered a protocol which does not deliver Brexit for Northern Ireland. There's no point saying Brexit's done when Northern Ireland has been subjugated from the rest of the United Kingdom, when the same rules don't apply, when there's a democratic deficit at the heart of our political institutions, and that something that was presented to protect the institutions is damaging the institutions and political stability in Northern Ireland. That's the fundamental.
Isn't Northern
and that's
Ireland,
what needs to be sorted.
Isn't there a simple majority here in Northern Ireland of parties, and that includes unionist parties like the Ulster Unionist Party, who say they are, you know, they don't exactly love the protocol, but they say they can work with it. Isn't there a simple majority of politicians here who actually say they can work with the protocol?
You're talking about people who've been elected to an assembly today that can have no say whatsoever on trade rules for Northern Ireland. None. If they have a vote in the assembly, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count, because these things are dealt with at the European Parliament. The Ulster Unionist Party doesn't say they can work with the protocol. In fact, every party in Northern Ireland will now say that yes, we recognise there's a problem and it needs to be solved. They need to get on and do it.
Gavin Williamson, DUP MP, thank you very much. So, Huw, as you can see, the protocol here is still a thorny issue. Lots of people on the doorsteps may have said that other issues were more important, but clearly, as you've heard from the DUP, as far as they're concerned, unless the protocol is sorted out, there can't be any real progress in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Back to you.
Anita, thanks very much again. Anita McVeigh there with the latest on the results coming in Northern Ireland. 20 out of 22 local authorities now declared in Wales. So we're nearly at the end of the results journey in Wales. Rita, what can you tell us?
Huw, I can show you how many councillors each of the main parties has gained or lost. And as you say, we are very nearly there in Wales. So Labour, it's had a good night in Wales. It's gained 64 councillors. By contrast, Plaid has lost 9 councillors, although it's actually gained control of a handful of councils. I'll show you that in a moment. The Conservatives losing 75. I mean, that is getting on for half of their councillors in Wales. So, a poor showing by the Conservatives tonight. Lib Dems in keeping with their generally good performance. And look at that, the Greens gaining 8 councillors from 0. That is all the councillors that have been elected for the Greens in this election. I said I'd show you the councils, and there you have it. Labour has gained 1. Plaid has gained 3, despite the fact that it's actually lost individual councillors. A couple of the councils that were run by independents are now no longer so. The Conservatives have lost control of 1, and there is 1 fewer hung council. Let's look at some of the individual results, the latest results. Now, Bridgend is a Labour gain from no overall control. Cardiff is a Labour hold, but what I can tell you is in both councils, the Labour number of seats has increased dramatically at the expense of the Conservatives. So both showing similar pictures in terms of voting patterns. In Blaen y Gwent, that is a Labour gain from independents. Wrexham remains a hung council. Plaid has gained Ceredigion, Carmarthenshire and Anglesey. All 3 of them were hung councils before. And the Conservatives have lost Monmouthshire. And let's just have a look at what has happened there in a little bit more detail. So this was a Conservative council 5 years ago when these seats were last up for election, and they won several seats back then. Let's have a look and see what's happened to the complexion of the council. So there you go, a straightforward handover, reluctantly, from the Conservatives to Labour. So, you know, a good result for Labour. They didn't win the council, they haven't gained control of it, but they've inflicted real damage on the Conservatives there.
Rita, thanks very much. And as I understand it, just to add to those Welsh results, Labour have lost control, as goes against the trend that we're seeing in other parts of Wales, lost control of Neath, that's Neath Port Talbot. Let's have a look at the figures. Just been given them now. So let's take a look. Neath Port Talbot, which is in industrial South Wales. It's between Bridgend and Swansea. 25 seats to Labour, 18 to the Independents. Now, that's actually a big increase, and 12 to Plaid Cymru. So let's look at the change. And Labour are down 13, with the Independents up 17. We'll ask a few more questions about that, because that certainly bucks the trend, and there's clearly a local issue going on there with that big independent group in Neath. Plaid Cymru down 5 in Neath Port Talbot. Neath, of course, the former parliamentary constituency of Peter Fein, who at one time was Secretary of State for Wales. And one of Mr Hain's successors joins us now, Conservative Secretary of State for Wales, Simon Hart. Simon, good evening. Thanks very much for joining us. And
not at all.
As I understand it, you're in beautiful Narberth, which is in Pembrokeshire, and we've got a few hints of lovely Pembrokeshire on the prints behind you on the wall, which is rather nice. And I'm sure you've got a bit of Tenby there as well, which is always nice to see. Now, what went wrong for you in these elections?
Say again?
What went wrong for you in these elections?
Well, it reminds me very much of 2012, when we were dealing with a very turbulent situation. We got a pretty stern ticking off from voters back then, with an instruction to get our stuff together by the next election. Back in 2012, we were able to do that. And our task and our instructions, I say, from the electorate is to do the same again. There's been, I think, a number of things that the figures you've just given are interesting insofar as it is quite a mixed picture in parts of Wales, some inexplicable or some sort of contrary numbers which don't quite match the national pattern. But I'm not going to sit here and deny the fact that, we've got a job work to do now to restore confidence, to restore trust. I think we can do that, and that's our task.
Can I just take one good example then of what happened for you, which was Monmouthshire? You lost control of Monmouthshire. You will have been campaigning there, I know that, and you'll know exactly what's been going on the ground. So what were people saying there to you about their reluctance to vote Conservative this time?
I think in many respects, although it was never a single thing, there was often a combination of issues. It was very much, as a warning rather than a terminal separating of the ways. And people were saying, look, this is my only chance to express my frustration and exasperation in between elections. So I'm going to either stay at home, I might opt for an independent or a different party if the mood takes me. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to be back in the fold by the next election. But you've got to demonstrate to me that the faith that I put in you in 2019, 2017, 2015, even back as far as 2010, hasn't been ill-founded, and that you can prove to me that you are the party that I supported. Now, some of that's around cost of living, some of it's around the background noise over Partygate and associated stuff. And so there was a bit of a mixture, but the message is consistent and clear. Now, in some places, we did better than others. So down here in Pembrokeshire, if you just, we started with 11 and we finished with 11. So it hasn't been absolutely the case everywhere, but nonetheless, it is still an important message.
Can we talk about cost of living, because you mentioned that, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about what you call background noise on Partygate. On the cost of living, the message has been very clear when we're talking to colleagues of yours overnight and during the day. Lots of them were saying, some of them more in sorrow than in anger, some of them, frankly, very angry, saying that the help from government for people who are really struggling at the moment is simply not enough. There needs to be more, and it needs to be delivered rather more quickly than, let's say, in a winter budget. It needs to be happening much more quickly than that. Now, is that the message that you're going to be taking back to Boris Johnson?
Well, I think that's that is a message which I've been receiving. I think the Chancellor has one of these impossible balancing acts, which is to try and keep, as far as possible, the lid on inflation, the lid on interest rate variations as best he possibly can, at the same time as providing as much by way of intervention as we legitimately can. Otherwise, what we don't want, worst of all worlds, would be for the interventionists to put such pressure on the public finances that inflation runs away from us and thereby undoes all of the things which we might be able to do by way of intervention. That is a very narrow path to tread. And I think the thing which maybe we need to get this message across more loudly, that the Chancellor has said right from the start, as he did during the pandemic, which is, look, nothing is ever ruled out. We have to see how the Ukraine conflict unfolds, because that's having a profound effect on our national finances. We've got to see how quickly we can eventually get away from the impact of the pandemic. So there are lots of moving parts in this, which means that, nothing, as I say, nothing is ever completely off the table. And I absolutely know what people are saying, particularly around energy costs, that it's no good just saying, well, we'll revisit this in a year's time, whatever it is. That's going to, we need to make sure that we're very flexible, very adaptable, and very empathetic to the concerns which are being raised. And that is our task.
People listening very carefully, Simon, to what you're saying will note that you're not really saying there needs to be action very urgently. You're saying that, you've got to be very careful about public finances and all the rest of it, and that's understandable. But you don't seem to be signalling, even after this set of results, that you want the Chancellor to be taking action in short measure and, in a matter of, let's say, weeks rather than months.
Well, I would contest that as politely as I can, and because I think the assumption there is that the Chancellor hasn't done anything at all and has no intention of doing anything. Actually, the interventions which have been made, whilst in some people's estimation maybe not enough soon enough, are nonetheless part of it. Every week when the Cabinet meets, we discuss the cost of living and what we can do. The PM is about to chair, I think, a cost of living Cabinet committee any second now. Not the first time that's been done. This is now the most important challenge facing government. Some of it is within our control. Some of it, by the way, is within the control of Welsh Government. So, looking forward to hearing what their views on all of this might be. And as I say, some of it, we are at the mercy of international trends, which isn't to make an excuse. It's just to say how adaptable we need to be. And I know, because I've heard the Chancellor say it on numerous occasions, as no doubt you have, is that our ambition is to make sure we help as many people as in the most generous way we possibly can, as soon as we can. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it's not as successful as we all like it. But I think, I say, one of many messages coming out of this set of election results is a very stark reminder, a very clear reminder that, as ever in politics, we remain permanently on probation. There is never a moment where we can sit back and say, well, that's that sorted. We are never in that position. We're as good, as I said earlier on, we're as good as our last game. And we have to, these election results remind us of just how important it is. We never lose sight of that.
You can't escape one thing, can you, which is that the cost of living crisis has been, approaching, and then it's actually come upon people when they've looked at their fuel bills, in the weeks before these elections took place. And the fact is that as far as you as a party are concerned, the message you've brought to voters on the measures that you've already taken, which the Chancellor's already taken on cost of living, have not convinced people. And you've not convinced them either that you've got measures in the pipeline which will help them down the road. Now, that's the message from these elections, surely.
I'm going to make one very trite-sounding comment here. Is that we have been trying desperately to talk about this issue every week for some weeks, but and I say this with the greatest of humility, some of our colleagues, our opposition colleagues, have been rather more anxious to talk about Partygate and all that kind of stuff, which has, but important though that is, has, I think, to some extent clouded the news landscape. But as I say, I don't want to overplay that, because you're absolutely right. What today's results show us is we've got significantly more work to do to demonstrate that part of the response, and not the whole response, but part of the response to the cost of living crisis isn't necessarily just by way of government interventions, important though they are. It's actually about creating the right circumstances for job creation and well-paid, sustainable, skilled jobs across Wales and the rest of the UK. And we mustn't lose sight of that. Our ambition remains, through levelling up and all of those other initiatives that you've heard of, absolutely to make sure we remain as a growing economy, internationally competitive, internationally attractive. As we heard from Airbus yesterday, new 550 jobs going to be created up in Broughton in North Wales. Those are the kind of things which will help us through the cost of living crisis, just as much as what the UK Gov is able to do by intervening where people hit particular moments of hardship.
Just a final point, Simon, if I may. Are you concerned? Are you prepared to just share whatever concern you have that where the Conservatives have been hit, let's say in parts of the northeast of Wales, or let's say in places like Bridgend, where you did well at the general election, where the tide seems to have turned, certainly in local terms, are you concerned that unless you get your act together, not least on the cost of living agenda, those parliamentary seats will be in danger next time round?
Well, two things. There's an A and a B answer. The A answer is I don't think it necessarily follows. Indeed, history has shown it doesn't always follow that what happens in a local election is replicated in a general election. I think the idea that everything that happened today, the independent Tory tussle in Pembroke St Mary's South isn't necessarily going to be the tussle which happens in whenever the next general election is. So it's important not to make too many hard and fast connections about what might happen at some future stage when we don't know what the world will look like. But on the other hand, I do take the point that actually what it reminds us absolutely is that when you talk about sort of where we are in the general scheme of things, we're always on probation. We are always going to be judged on what we do now and what our plans are for the future. We can't, just because we had a good election in 2019, doesn't mean that we necessarily can just sit back and expect to have a equally good one in 2024 or whenever it might be. And it is just a stark reminder, and a very timely one, that all of us, and anybody in politics, whatever party knows this, you just have to never lose sight of the fact that we're constantly under the spotlight. And if you were talking to the PM now, who's going to be back in Wales in a couple of weeks' time, he'd be absolutely recognising that, he's always under examination, and quite rightly so. That's what we do.
Simon Hart, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Secretary
of State for Wales there, Simon Hart, Conservative MP in Pembrokeshire. Our thanks to Simon for joining us. Let's bring in John Stevens, Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Mail, waiting patiently to talk. John, thanks very much. And Nancy Fielder, Editor of the Sheffield Star. Nancy, thank you very much as well. I said hello earlier, but that seemed a while ago, so it's good to welcome you back too. John, were you convinced there that Simon Hart gets the message of these elections?
I think just to bring up one of the things that he was talking about there, the cost of living crisis, what Tory MPs have been saying is that there haven't been concerns just about how much the government is doing to address this. There have been problems with selling what they are going to do on the doorsteps. So it's all rather complicated. Look at what Rishi Sunak has announced. He's talked about how people would get some sort of discount on their energy bills, which is really some sort of loan that you will start paying back next year. It's rather complicated. That's quite difficult to sell on a doorstep. They're also talking about a rebate on council tax if you live in certain banned properties. So I think there has been a slight problem with explaining to people what exactly are they going to do. And you compare that to Labour. They've been banging on about how we should get rid of VAT on domestic fuel bills since before the budget last year, putting that on leaflets through people's doors and just repeating that message over and over again, whilst also saying that we need a windfall tax on big oil firms. And one thing they're blessed with there is because of the results that oil firms have to put out, you've got a constant rotation of firms coming out there and saying, we're making amazing profits. We had BP earlier this week, we had Shell yesterday. So it's very easy for Labour politicians to say, here are these big cats making all of this money. Shouldn't we be using some of that money to help people in need?
So when Simon Hart was saying, well, we've got to look at the public finances, we can't make open-ended commitments, there will be a budget later on this year, there is some help that's already there, which you've alluded to. Do you think that's going to convince people, just to ask my question in a different way, that they've taken a message away from these results, which is we need to do something different. We need to do something more quickly. We need to do something that is easier to understand. And we need to do something that people will see immediately in terms of a practical result.
Yeah, and I think there has been some pressure on ministers to do that in the last few months. But if you're an MP sitting in one of those seats where you've seen the Labour Party making advances, certain places in England, we know that they haven't done incredibly well. They haven't put on hundreds of councillors across the country. But in certain places, they have taken councillors. And you've also got the threat of the Lib Dems coming back again. And I think if you were a Tory MP in one of those many southern seats, those places that used to be bright gold, places like my home county, Cornwall, places like Somerset, where there used to be solid Lib Dem for year after year. Then in 2015, David Cameron came along, he smashed down that golden wall. He managed to bring in loads of Tory MPs. That's how they managed to get their majority in 2015. I think those people who, for 2017, we didn't really see a Lib Dem resurgence. 2019, they didn't really come back at all. I think those people now will be the people hammering on Rishi Sunak's door, saying, hang on a minute, I think I'm at risk of losing my job and you need to do more to help me.
Let's bring in Nancy. Nancy, what do you make of the batch of results in your own region? You're editor of the Sheffield Star. I'm thinking about Yorkshire and how important that is in terms of the makeup of maths and seats at Westminster. What is your reading of what's going on there?
So in South Yorkshire, we have re-elected Labour. We've got a new Labour mayor, Oliver Coppard, announced this afternoon. A clear majority there. I don't think that was ever in doubt. Sheffield Council is facing another year of coalition because it gained some, it lost some, but it didn't get back overall control. Again, not surprising. And Greens and Lib Dems did all right. But I think what's really surprising, well, maybe not surprising, but what actually is the clearest message from across the north is that we've had a wounded Prime Minister. We've got people who are absolutely desperately panicked about cost of living, and still Labour haven't managed to make the gains that you would have expected them to. I think they really need to hear this message that everybody at the last election who was lifelong Labour felt taken for granted, felt that the North hadn't gained from constantly supporting Labour for generations. And they turn to the Conservatives and they're not turning back in droves. Boris Johnson is playing a great game of saying he's levelling up. The evidence is not here. We cannot see the levelling up. We cannot feel the levelling up. So why is Labour not striding on faster? I think that's my real big question from the North after today's set of results.
I suppose I'd turn it back really on you, Nancy, and ask you, given what you've been saying and the people you've been talking to, and you'll have been asking questions today, certainly in the light of the results, what's your tentative answer to that? What is the Labour issue with winning people back?
I think it's the leadership. I don't think there's a massive amount of confidence that Keir Starmer can really change things for the North and can give us can balance it up, the desperately needed funding. The trust has just worn down so massively over such a long time with the Labour Party. You would have thought they would gain it back. I think on the doorsteps, it really is cost of living that is worrying people, but there is still Partygate. How are we still voting for a Labour? How are we still voting for a Prime Minister who has got all these issues in the background? They still feel that they trust him perhaps more than they have trust in Keir Starmer to turn this around. And I think all the parties really need to look at what your average person is saying, because I've had overwhelmingly, we always write lots and lots of columns about however you vote, please vote. We would never tell people how to vote. That's not the job of a local newspaper, I don't believe. And we've had so many people going back saying, I completely agree with that, I always vote. And this time I am just so fed up with the politicians. I've sort of lost the appetite for it. And that's a massive problem as well.
Bear with us then, Nancy, because you've raised several points there that I think are worth putting to Lucy Powell, who's joined us kindly, Labour's Shadow Culture Secretary. Lucy, thanks very much for joining us. From Nancy there in Sheffield, that's quite damning, saying that, in her view, she can't understand why Labour isn't capitalising more on the Prime Minister's own circumstances and the fact that there is this dreadful cost of living crisis. Do you think she's making fair points?
Well, look, I mean, I don't totally agree with her analysis there, in the sense that I think we have made significant and real and tangible progress in these elections, in the Midlands, in the North, in many areas and parliamentary constituencies that we lost in the 2019 general election. And I think, you can look across the piece at that, whether it's Dudley, whether it's Workington and Copeland, or in Lancashire and Yorkshire, in Hartlepool, in Greater Manchester. We are making progress in these key parliamentary seats, and would on the face of today's results be winning many dozens of those parliamentary constituencies. But where I would perhaps agree with her a little bit more is that the challenge for Labour to come back from that, very significant loss that we faced in 2019, our worst general election result since 1935, I think, to come back from that in very short order was just never going to happen. And most of us, I think, certainly those of us in the shadow cabinet and Keir Starmer himself, we recognised that this was going to be a massive mountain for us to climb, because the red wall didn't just go in 1 year in 2019. It's actually been crumbling for nearly 20 years. And when you face those sort of long-term political trends with our traditional working class voters moving away from us over many, many years, it takes time to rebuild that relationship and rebuild that trust. But I think today's results show us that we have stemmed the tide in that regard. And to mix my metaphors, we've perhaps sort of reached base camp, but we've still got the summit to climb.
You're looking at the potential likely by-election, obviously, in Wakefield, given that we were talking about Yorkshire. How do you view that prospect in the light of these results?
Well, I think we've made some gains in Wakefield today, overnight. So that's obviously, reassuring and gives us hope in that by-election. But, we are not at all complacent. We take nothing for granted, and people of Wakefield did turn against Labour in quite large number. I think the Conservative majority there is over 3,000 in that 2019 election. And, people want to hear Labour talking about the issues, addressing the issues, having a plan for the issues that they care about in Wakefield and other parts of the country, whether that is the cost of living crisis. And I think the journalist from the Mail was just saying there before that we have got a very clear, radical, a costed plan that would really address the cost of living crisis for people when it comes to energy bills, with the windfall tax and the cut in VAT. And in places like Wakefield, where the job opportunities aren't there that perhaps there are in other places. If there are job opportunities, it's very hard to get to them because transport infrastructure is can age and there isn't well connected in terms of trains and so on. And these are the bread and butter issues that I think people want to hear the Labour Party talking about. And they're the kind of areas that we're going to be contesting that by-election on, not taking a single vote for granted.
I take the point about, you're not being complacent and you don't take anything for granted. You said that, and that's all noted. There'll be party colleagues of yours watching this, and they'll be saying to themselves very clearly, we can't not win Wakefield in the by-election, because that would be a disastrous signal about our prospects looking ahead to the general election. Now, you may not want to acknowledge that, Lucy, so openly, but surely you will sympathise with the sentiments that they'll be expressing.
Well, we're campaigning to win that by-election, absolutely. That would be what we would hope to be the outcome. That's what we would want the outcome to be and like the outcome to be. And we'll work incredibly hard to make that happen. And I think today's results show us that we are able to continue to make inroads and to stem that tide and to turn that around in places like Wakefield. And there are many other examples of those coming out today. But I think what I would say to some of my colleagues and maybe Labour Party members is, I think some people have thought, well, it's a disaster for the government at the moment, therefore it's just so easy for Labour, we should just be home and dry. I don't think, if you've got that view, I don't think you really understood the deep and profound fracturing of our relationship with many voters that led to the 2019 election that had been coming for many, many years before. And actually, Keir himself and the shadow cabinet, we understand that this is a long, hard road for Labour, and we're very pleased that we are now some way down that road, but we're far from the end of it. And we've got to redouble our efforts to continue in that vein.
Lucy, thanks very much for joining us. Good to talk to you again. Lucy Powell, the Shadow Culture Secretary there for Labour. Nancy, can I come back to you and ask you about Wakefield? Do you think that's a by-election that, is eminently winnable for Labour? What is your thought?
It should be. I'm not convinced it is eminently winnable, but you are right. It is absolutely key because people vote differently for their councils as they will do for their MPs. So it is a massive one that Labour really, really needs to get in their back pocket to be able to say, what was it Keir Starmer said today? It was a massive turning point. It's not a massive turning point. It's a step, quite a small step, and generations of mistrust needs to be rebuilt. And that is a really good place to start. And the message, if it doesn't start there, is not going to be good at all.
Nancy, thanks very much. Nancy Fielder there for the editor of the Sheffield Star. And just a quick word from you, John, given that we've come full circle on that in terms of Labour and the Wakefield by-election. Where for you does this set of elections leave the political landscape? Would you agree that Keir Starmer has got a point in saying that some kind of turning point has been reached for Labour? Or do you think it's not there for them yet?
I think if you look at those seats across the Red Wall today, those places in the North and the Midlands that switched to the Tories the first time in 2019, it really has been a mixed picture. You look down at the list of seats, there are some places that Labour can point to say that they've made gains. They can point to particular councils like Kirklees, Rossendale, Calderdale, where they can say those are places where there are seats that we need to win, that we have made progress. But at the same time, the Tories can equally give you another list of places like Amber Valley, Sunderland, Sandwell, and say in those places, Labour's going backwards. So I think it's very hard for Keir Starmer to be able to say that they are really making the significant progress that Labour would need to make in order to get a majority. And you just look at how far Labour is coming from behind. They need to get another 127 seats to be able to get a majority. So you really need to make significant gains in these places. And going back to the Wakefield by-election, you speak to people in Labour behind the scenes and they say that is absolutely must win. There is just absolutely no option about that. And if they don't win that, I think there will be serious questions about Keir's leadership.
Equally, just final point, John, equally Conservative people are saying behind the scenes, if the cost of living agenda and policy is not radically changed and boosted and done in a way which people can understand quickly, well, then a by-election like Wakefield will look more winnable for Labour, certainly. So the pressure's on the government as well to deliver before that takes place.
Yeah, and the pressure's on the government not just on kind of giving people a bit of extra money for their energy bill. It's about tax. And the Tories are meant to be a tax-cutting party. We've heard Rishi Sunak over and over again say how he wants to cut taxes. But a lot of people on the Tory backbenches saying now the best way that we could make life easier for people now would be to reduce their taxes instead of whacking up things like national insurance.
OK, John, many thanks. Rita, I'm over to you for the next instalment.
The next instalment is Scotland, Huw. We've got all the councils declared now, and this is the state of play for all the main parties in terms of their share of the vote. And as you can see, the SNP has come top. It's not just come top, but it's actually increased its share from the last election in 2017. Then it was on 32%. Now it's on 34%. That is its best share since it became the government back in 2007. So no sign of the midterm blues in terms of share of the vote with the SNP. Labour on 22%, 2 points ahead of the Conservatives, so they are now in second place. There'll be a big sigh of relief from the Labour Party over that. The Conservatives have slipped back, as you can see. The Lib Dems and the Greens have both picked up in terms of share. Let me show you some of the individual council results. Dundee, an SNP gain from no overall control. West Bartonshire, a Labour gain, again from a hung council. And all these other grey councils are all hung. So Edinburgh, Aberdeen. I can tell you that in these three that are in the central belt, so Clackmannanshire, Renfrewshire and West Lothian, although they are in no overall control, actually the SNP is just within 1 or 2 seats of taking control of those councils. So although they look grey, the SNP has performed well there. I just want to go into Glasgow and show you the details here, because Glasgow, you know, an iconic council. It had been Labour for so many years before it went hung 5 years ago. It is where Anna Sarwar and Nicola Sturgeon are both MSPs, and you can see just a sliver between the SNP and Labour in terms of seats. The SNP are short by 6 seats of a majority. But the reason it's interesting is, look at that, the SNP have lost a couple of seats, the Conservatives have really fallen back, and it's Labour and the Greens who gained there. This is in terms of the first preference share of the vote, but as always, I always like the first preference change since 2017. The SNP has actually slipped back in Glasgow, as have the Conservatives, and that is to the advantage of Labour and the Green Party.
Rita, many thanks with that overview for us of what's been going on in Scotland. Now that we have a full set to consider so that we can make some more definitive statements about it, we're going to join Kate Forbes, who's the Scottish Finance Secretary of the Scottish National Party in Dingwall. Kate, thanks very much. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Nice to talk to you. And I'm just looking there at the results, which for a party that's been in power for such a long time, it's a remarkable set of results, really. What's led to it?
Well, it's the 11th consecutive win. And as we just heard, it's not just any win, it's a win by some considerable margin in terms of both increased share of the vote, increasing the number of councillors. And as has been alluded to, we've also seen the number of councils where the SNP have a larger share of the council increase as well. I mean, I think the bottom line is that it demonstrates that the people of Scotland still have trust in the policies and the leadership and the values of the SNP. And they've shown that not just at a national level this time last year, this very day last year, but they've also shown it at a local level as well. And on the flip side, it's also judgment on our opponents. You know, it's a devastating defeat for the Conservatives.
What did you make of the balance on the other parties? I know that, you know, I'm going to ask you to be as impartial as you can be, which may not be very impartial, given that, in fairness, you're representing your own party. But you see Labour moving back into second place and the Conservatives into third place in terms of popular support. Does that tell you that the Labour challenge that you're likely to face in the next election to Westminster and then to the Scottish Parliament is going to be considerably more vigorous than the one you've been experiencing so far? What's your reading of how the landscape has changed?
I don't think so, largely because I think Labour's advance, as it were, has been almost entirely at the Conservatives' defeat. So the Conservatives have lost over 60 councillors, and we've seen Labour take advantage of that in certain areas. But remember, Labour and the Conservatives are fighting it out for second place, far behind us in the rear-view mirror. And I think ultimately where you've seen the most advances in this election is with, for example, pro-independence parties, the SNP and the Greens. So our sense of it is that even in somewhere like Glasgow, where Labour have thrown everything at it, we're desperately hoping to have made more progress, perhaps to take back Glasgow. They haven't been able to do that, despite what they've thrown at it and despite the Conservatives falling back.
Can we talk about momentum, and certainly in terms of the independence debate? Because clearly one of the issues here is to do with raising people's expectations for any party that is successful. And lots of your supporters are clearly hoping that this will turbocharge your campaign for a referendum and another go at independence. Is that the message here, that it's full steam ahead? I asked this question to Ian Blackford earlier today. Full steam ahead on that referendum campaign, and that is something that you are set to deliver within the timescale that you've set out.
We are already full steam ahead in the sense that this time last year, we obviously secured the mandate. So when I was last re-elected, we secured that mandate. But it's no surprise that the SNP stand for independence. And when people are voting, they will have that in mind. There's a question of trust, and there's also a question of the future of our nation. And we are making progress. The First Minister was very clear in our election last year that as we started to come out of COVID, it would be the right time to put that question back to the people, and work is progressing. I think Ian Blackford talked to you about the papers that we're due to publish in terms of the economic prospectus for independence and consulting with the people and responding to some of the questions that have been put to us. So that work is ongoing. As I said, this is the 11th consecutive win for the SNP. In each of these elections, the SNP has stood for independence and for moving Scotland into a place where we can have put that question back to the people.
What evidence is there, just on the same theme, that the view of the Scottish people on independence has changed significantly since that referendum that was held in 2014? Is there any credible evidence on that?
I mean, there's huge amounts of evidence. You need only look at the polling even today or this time last year in terms of the Conservatives, who have one policy really, which is no to a second independence referendum, and consistently and repeatedly have failed to win a majority or come anywhere close to the SNP. We have the polling today, which demonstrates again that pro-independence parties are making progress. We know without a shadow of a doubt that people are sick and tired of being taken for granted by the Westminster government, whether it's Partygate, whether it's a lack of progress on the cost of living, whether it's just the fact that they say no to democracy, no to putting that question back to the people in the form of a referendum. It's always the party that's most scared of the result that will say no, whereas we believe that that question should be put to the people. We will set out that prospectus, and we believe that when that question is put to the people will choose to put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands rather than leave it at the UK government.
It'll all be seen, Kate. It'll all come out in the wash at some point. So thanks very much for joining us again. Kate Forbes there, the Scottish Finance Secretary for the Scottish National Party, joining us there from Dingwall. My thanks to John Stevens from the Daily Mail, Deputy Political Editor, for joining me in the studio. John's going to be leaving us in a few seconds. And to you, Nancy, as well, down the line in Sheffield, editor of the Sheffield Star. It was lovely to have you with us too. Thanks very much to you, Nancy. So some news in a second, but we'll take a little break to see whether we're going to have some nice weather coming up over the weekend. Here's Thomas.
Good evening.
Well, hello and welcome back once again to the BBC election studio at New Broadcasting House in London. This is where we've been for the last, getting on for 24 hours and having a close look at those results as they started to come in last night in the English councils. Well, most of those have come in now, all bar two, I think. 144 of the 146 English local authorities have come in with quite heavy losses for the Conservatives in some areas. A very upbeat performance by the Lib Dems, making quite impressive gains in some areas, and Labour making some more modest gains in terms of seats, but capturing a few high-profile local authorities, including Barnet in London and Westminster in London and Wandsworth in London. So the English picture we'll talk a little more about. The Welsh picture too, most of those in Scotland, as we've been discussing in the last few minutes. We've got a pretty firm picture there. The one big unknown is Northern Ireland in terms of the full set of results, because we'll have to wait for that into the early hours, maybe even to lunchtime tomorrow. But we already know that history is being made with Sinn Féin topping the poll there for the first time in elections to the Assembly. So history being made as we speak in Northern Ireland, with the votes being counted there. We'll have lots of that to talk about after the news, and that is with Sean.
Thank you very much, Huw, and welcome if you've just joined us at home. Here's a summary of those election stories. The Prime Minister says it's been a tough set of elections for the Conservative Party. It's lost hundreds of seats. Labour has won control of some of the Tories' flagship councils in London, but made few significant gains elsewhere. It was a good night all round for the Liberal Democrats and for the Green Party. In Scotland, the SNP has once again finished as the largest party. Labour's come second, with the Conservatives suffering heavy losses. Our political editor Laura Coonsbo's report does contain some flashing images.
OK, folks, this is going well.
Trademark optimism, despite shedding councils and losing nearly 400 councillors too. But in the safety of a primary school classroom in his constituency, the Prime Minister didn't seem downcast.
That's very good, that blue margin there you've done. What about some sort of baubles here?
He lost iconic London councils, giving away comfortable Conservative ground.
And what are we going to have when we have the party?
Yet anger at Downing Street parties and his fine for breaking the law
There you go.
did not translate into the catastrophe some Conservatives had feared.
It's mid-term and it's certainly a mixed set of results, and we've had a tough night in some parts of the country, but on the other hand, in other parts of the country, you're still seeing Conservatives going forward and making quite remarkable gains in places that haven't voted Conservative for a long time, or if ever.
Not in London, where his Labour rival had big reasons to smile this morning, winning over territory held by the Tories for decades.
We've just done it! Yay! Westminster! Yay! Wandsworth!
Steps forward, but outside London, perhaps not big, bold strides Labour needs.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Have you heard from Durham Police, Sir Keir? Any comment on their investigation?
Yet as he travelled to celebrate success elsewhere, allegations over lockdown chased the Labour leader. Durham Police will now investigate claims that Keir Starmer broke the rules, having beer and curry with colleagues during lockdown.
Anything to say about the investigation, Sir Keir? Have you heard from Durham Police?
He's always said nothing went wrong, but they are questions Keir Starmer will have to answer. Voters' response to the Lib Dems was warm in many places, grabbing seats from Labour in the northern city Hull, from the Tories in Kent's Tunbridge Wells, Somerset and pockets of affluent London. The message to the Tories from some green suburbs will cause Tory nerves.
They're saying they've had enough of this Prime Minister. And I think the tectonic plates of British politics are shifting. And now it's up to Conservative MPs to shove the Prime Minister into the abyss.
Remember, your votes stitch together a giant patchwork, not a picture that's the same in every corner of the country.
You're my mum's counsellor, yeah?
There was striking Labour success in London that will hurt for the Tories, who broadly fell back further in the south than in the north of England, their coalition fraying more at its traditional end. But Labour's jubilation in the capital wasn't always matched by enthusiasm elsewhere. The Greens picking up pace too, with dozens of gains. But while results in England perhaps confirmed much of the status quo, the scene is set for a genuine moment of change in Northern Ireland. Look at this. For the first time, voters seem poised to make Sinn Féin the biggest party. That would be a moment of history and a moment of challenge and uncertainty for the UK.
I'm very grateful for all those people that came out and engaged in what was a very positive campaign.
Leaders whose dream is leaving the Union for a united Ireland would be in charge. Yay! And that could also shift the political conversation in Scotland, where the SNP, who also want to leave the UK, continue their years of dominance. Crucially, Labour moves up into second place. The Scottish Tories in a slump. And grew in Wales too, the biggest party profiting at the expense of the Tories.
Yet spin back a few weeks, many Tories in there feared a complete calamity.
They've had a terrible time in some parts of the country, but this hasn't been a wipeout. And Labour has moved forward, but not far or fast enough to be sure of power. Remember, these elections give us clues, not concrete convictions of what's coming next. But it seems the two big parties are somehow locked in an uncomfortable status quo.
That is very good.
No dramatic breakthrough for his main rival. No total breakdown for the Conservatives. Boris Johnson has taken knocks today, but still stands to carry on. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
As Laura was reporting there, police in Durham are investigating whether the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer broke lockdown rules last April on a visit during which he drank beer in an MP's office. The force initially decided that no offence had occurred, but now says it's received significant new information. Here's what Sir Keir Starmer had to say on the matter this evening.
As I've explained a number of times, we were working in the office, we stopped for something to eat, no party, no breach of the rules. The police obviously have got their job to do, we should let them get on with it, but I'm confident that no rules were broken. Meanwhile, we've had a really good set of results today.
The SNP has emerged as the winner of the elections in Scotland. Labour has overtaken the Conservatives, becoming the second largest party for the first time in 6 years. With all results now declared, the SNP has gained 22 seats overall. Labour has added 20. The Conservatives lost 63 of their Scottish councillors. In Wales, Labour made gains while the Conservatives suffered significant losses. The latest results show Labour has gained 65 seats and now controls 8 councils. Plaid Cymru now oversees 4 councils. In Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin is on course for its best ever result in Northern Ireland Assembly elections. It received the most first preference votes. The Unionist Party, the DUP, which had been the largest party, came second. With counting for the 90 Stormont seats continuing tonight, Sinn Féin is so far well ahead of the DUP, as well as of the Alliance Party and the Ulster Unionist parties. And if you want to find out the election results in your area, you'll have a look on the BBC News website or the BBC News app. Just type in your postcode and the results will appear. You'll also find on those pages lots of election analysis and reports from our teams across the country. Those are the main election stories. Now back to elections 2022.
Welcome back. It's the final 20 minutes or so of this marathon broadcast. It's good to have you all with us, and what we're doing is trying to tie up some of the loose ends, and I'm very pleased to be joined by 2 new guests. Sonia Soda from the Observer. Welcome, Sonia. Nice to see you. And we also have down the line Tim Stanley from the Daily Telegraph. Tim, lovely to have you with us as well. Thanks for joining us. So if you both just bear with me, I'll be with you in just a moment, because I want to discuss with you in part what's going on in Northern Ireland as well as England, Wales and Scotland. So let me just bring in Anita as well, my colleague Anita McVeigh in Belfast. And Anita, you've spoken to lots of guests there today from different parties, and you've got quite a lot of information out of them in terms of the way they see the next few weeks and months. Given your own vantage point and your own knowledge of Northern Ireland, just wondering, how do you see things as the count progresses now? We've got how many left to declare, and when do you think we'll have a full set?
Well, we are just over a third of the way through. So we now have 31 of the seats declared, Huw, out of a total of 90 to be declared. It's definitely been moving slower, much slower than anticipated, because it was my understanding that the Chief Electoral Officer was hoping that this could all be done and dusted tonight, or certainly into the early hours of tomorrow morning. But it's moving really quite slowly, so the decision has been made that they're going to stop counting around 11 p.m. tonight and come back tomorrow morning, not just here but at the other 2 count centres in Northern Ireland. So we won't get the full picture until tomorrow afternoon. I think it might be the middle of the afternoon before we get those full set of results.
Talking earlier, and you were explaining to us what's happened in terms of the outcome of the vote there, and the fact that Sinn Féin for the first time has come on top. You've been talking to them earlier. What's your sense of what they want to do with that new success? and what is their strategy for the coming weeks?
Well, I spoke to Mary Lou McDonald, who's the leader of Sinn Féin, a little earlier, and she said their priority was to deal with those bread and butter issues that lots of people, irrespective of their political traditions and background, have been talking about in this campaign. The bread and butter issues like dealing with the cost of living crisis and healthcare, education and so on. But I put to her the question about the time frame for a border poll, a poll on the question of Irish unity. Now, interestingly, Sinn Féin haven't talked about this during their campaign. It's been the Democratic Unionist Party saying vote for us in order to stop Sinn Féin becoming First Minister because a border poll will follow. So I put that question on a time frame to Mary Lou McDonald, and what she said to me was that there is a provision within the Good Friday Agreement which led to the power sharing arrangement here in Northern Ireland for referendums to take place. She said she thought it would be within a decade, and she said her personal view was that it would be within 5 years. So, I said to her, do you understand the concerns of unionists? And members of Sinn Féin that I've spoken to have told me, yes, they do. So it's going to be interesting to see what the response is from unionists to that when we get the full set of results and see exactly where the parties are relative to one another. As for the unionist side, I've spoken to several figures from the Democratic Unionist Party. They're anti-protocol. That, of course, is the set of rules that governs trade, post-Brexit trade here in Northern Ireland. And the party leader has repeated his view, that's Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, that there can be no return to a power-sharing assembly at Stormont unless their concerns over the protocol are sorted out. So that's between the Westminster government and the EU, he says, to sort out those concerns to their satisfaction.
When we look at the potential appointment of a new First Minister, Anita, again, there's been lots of speculation over the last few weeks about what would happen if Sinn Féin came on top of the poll and then nominated Michelle O'Neill, let's say, as First Minister. What would the Unionists do in that circumstance? Can you shed more light on what might happen in those circumstances?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the DUP in particular has been asked this question over and over again throughout the campaign, and they haven't said, when asked, if Sinn Féin top the poll and have the right to nominate the position of First Minister, will you nominate a member of your party if you come in second position, second largest party, to the position of Deputy First Minister? And they have said they won't. Now, when I put that to Mary Lou McDonald from Sinn Féin, she said, look, since the Good Friday Agreement, it's always been a unionist in the position of First Minister and Sinn Féin as Deputy First Minister. So she said this is just democracy, and the DUP need to make that nomination if the position is reversed. But the thing is, the DUP are saying that they're not going to return to the executive. So it's possible, therefore, that they can actually avoid going through that process of nomination, or say that they won't nominate until those issues with the protocol are sorted out to their satisfaction, which brings us back to this whole idea of, is politics functional or dysfunctional in Northern Ireland? There are 8 days after the MLAs are returned when they have to meet at Stormont to potentially nominate. But if that nomination doesn't happen, then we go into an extended period, another 6 months of talks about trying to get power sharing up and running again in Northern Ireland. At the end of that period, if nothing happens, there is the potential for another election. But obviously lots of people are hoping, and on the doorsteps lots of people have been saying that they want politics to work in a functional way here. They want their assembly members back at Stormont making decisions on issues that affect their daily lives. But we could be in a position, Huw, where there is a continuing stalemate.
Anita, many thanks once again, and thanks for the interviews with all the guests. It's been a really useful and informative evening. So thanks very much to Anita and the team there. And to Rita, who's in this building with me, though not in the studio. Rita, just let's have a final state of affairs from you, if we can, because we've been looking at the various component parts of the election as we've gone through from last night. So with the vast majority of these council results in, why don't you take us through what we have?
Huw, as you can see in England, just 2 councils left to be declared. So this is pretty much the settled picture in England. And Labour, you can see, have won this election. They've picked up 52 councillors, but it's not the great big advance that they might have wished to see, particularly in certain parts of the country. We'll come to a bit more detail in a moment. The Conservatives have had a bad night of it. They've lost 341 councillors. This is just in England. If you take in Wales and Scotland too, they've lost 486 councillors. That's a very poor performance, and we've heard Tory councillors bemoaning the loss of their colleagues and bemoaning their performance. That's something that's going to be picked over in the next few days and weeks, I'm sure. The Lib Dems, by contrast, have had a really good night of it. They've picked up 192 councillors. They're a really successful performance by them. And the Greens have doubled their number of councillors. They've added 60 councillors in England, and they're now on 113. As I said, let's have a look at some of the individual results. And this screen really tells a tale of Conservative woes, because Westminster, a big totemic London Borough Council, which had been Conservative since its inception, it's gone red. Labour also took Wandsworth and Barnet from the Conservatives, so they inflicted real pain on the Conservatives in London. They also have taken support from the Conservatives in the south of England, so Southampton, a Labour gain from the Conservatives. The Conservatives have lost control of Monmouthshire in Wales, and that was the only council in Wales that they had overall control of until this election. They've lost control in West Oxfordshire, which is where David Cameron had his seat, in Huntingdonshire, where John Major had his seat when he was an MP. Elsewhere, Labour have done well in Wales. They've gained Bridgend from no overall control, and that again is another story of the Conservatives losing support and Labour benefiting from that. The SNP remain preeminent in Scotland, and Dundee is a gain for them from no overall control. And the Lib Dems, a strong performance from them, particularly in the south of England and towards the east, and they've gained, for example, Gosport from the Conservatives. If you want to find out what's happened in your area, do remember to go to the BBC News website, and you can just find the postcode checker, put in your postcode, and you'll find out what's happened in your area. You can find that on the website, as I said, or on the BBC News app, so I'd encourage you to use it.
Rita, fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks to you and the team for all the information that you brought to us from last night and all through today. So many thanks to you, Rita. Right, I've got Sonia with me here, and Tim is on the line from the Daily Telegraph. Sonia, first of all, big thought. Where are we tonight?
Well, I think both of the parties have got something to take solace in, but also something to be a bit disappointed about. So for the Conservatives, actually, they've lost a lot of seats today. I think probably, it all comes down to what does this mean for the future of Boris Johnson, I think. I think probably you're not going to see his MPs move against him in the next week or two. I think there is a few things that are saving him. The fact that there isn't yet an obvious successor still. But I think it's a disappointing night for the Conservatives. For Labour, I think there are some bright spots. There are bright spots in Scotland, where Labour have come second. They've overtaken the Conservatives. In Wales, in London. But if you look at the rest of England, Labour just aren't in the place that they need to be if they were to win a majority in 2024, which is what I think a lot of Labour supporters will be looking for. So it's kind of okay with some bright spots, but not as good as it could be.
What's Labour's main problem?
I personally think that they've got an issue with the leader, Keir Starmer. So I think Keir Starmer, he's got a lot of assets as a leader, but one of his big downsides is he's not as able a communicator as some Labour politicians, the real winning politicians like Tony Blair have been in the past. And I think for Labour to be banking on doing very well in 2024, they need a leader who can speak to what is now quite a diverse electoral coalition. It combines traditional working class voters, quite affluent young voters in university towns. You've got to have somebody who says, this is what Labour is for. This is our vision. This is what we stand for. At the moment, it feels to me like Labour is a party that is sort of trading off, reacting against some of the scandals that are happening to the Conservatives. Now, that can take you quite a long way, particularly in a set of local elections, which is about delivering a message to the government. But I think most analysts would agree that Labour is not where they need to be if they were looking at winning majority. And I do think that comes down to Keir Starmer.
Tim, nearly 24 hours since the polls closed. Where do you see things now that most of these votes have been counted?
I agree with a lot of that analysis. In some ways, it feels a bit stalematey. And the perfect bookend to the election campaign was Keir Starmer being hit again with Beergate. This ought to be a triumphant moment for him, but instead he's having to answer questions about something that he attacked the Prime Minister on. And it adds to that sense of the inability to sort of take off. Labour did do very well. There's no denying that. It essentially won this election. And that coming second in Scotland is particularly significant, I feel. It strengthened its position in Wales. It is clearly dominant in London. It didn't do quite so well in the Red Wall. It could eventually catch up. Nonetheless, there are still problems. One has been, as we've said, is Keir Starmer's relationship with the British people and his charisma or lack of it. Another is that the opposition to the Tories is still quite fractured. The Lib Dems also had an excellent night, arguably a better one. They gained nearly 4 times as many council seats as Labour did. And the Green Party, with 60 seats, gained 8 more seats than Labour did. Now, of course, they're starting from lower tallies to begin with. But the point is that the, if you like, progressive alliance against the Tories is rather splintered. And one final thing, I think the most significant result of the night is probably actually Northern Ireland, where it looks as though the DUP has miscalculated on the fronts both of its position on Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also its refusal even to countenance that Sinn Fein taking the leading position in the executive, has probably actually, ironically, encouraged nationalists to coalesce around Sinn Fein. I think in historical terms, probably that result is the most important.
And can I ask you whether, in your view, Boris Johnson's position as leader and Prime Minister is more or less precarious tonight than it was last night?
It's probably exactly as it was before. He'll take a lot of he'll take courage from some of the results in the Red Wall. He'll take a lot of courage from the sudden rise again of Beergate. But having said all of that, I do think the Tories are in the long run in trouble. Brexit changed voting patterns in the north, yes. It also changed them in the south, and less attention has been given to that. The Lib Dems and the Greens are rising down here. I'm down in Kent. And with the Tories now raising taxes rather than lowering them, they're alienating traditional parts of their constituency. I think the Tories will have a tougher fight at the next general election in the south than they've had for a very long time.
And that, Tim, is a fascinating point, and I think we all agree that that's one of the points that needs to be really aired more kind of energetically than it has been, Sonia, because, yes, post-2016 and then post-2019, these very kind of robust voting patterns of the past have been fractured.
Yes.
And the South, what the Lib Dems have shown, certainly, and to an extent the Greens in the south of England, is that, the Tories face a very different challenge now, don't they?
I think that's right. And I think what's interesting is if you take today's results and sort of apply them to what would happen if there was a general election and people were voting in the same way. And what would happen is actually the Conservatives would lose their majority. They might not even be the largest party anymore. Labour might be the largest party, but it's still very hard to see Labour getting a majority under these sort of current voting patterns. So what you would see is probably, if this holds up, and it might not, but if it holds up, you would probably see a Labour minority government supported by the SNP and the Liberal Democrats. Now, that's a very different form of politics to one that we've known before. And actually what that might mean is that you get a sort of progressive coalition, but one that is focused in the first year or two, that's all about a Scottish independence referendum and whether that happens. And that's kind of that's a very different type of politics to, say, the politics we saw in '97, which which is the last time you saw a very big progressive majority delivered to the Labour Party, and might, you know, quite not be what people were expecting. So I think we've got something different on the cards. You never know. We might see something very similar to, you know, what happened in 1974, where Labour becomes a minority administration and then there is a general election quite quickly. But I think this does all contribute to the sense that sort of British politics is changing, and the days of very big swings from the left to the right, you know, maybe they're over because the vote is more fractured.
It is fascinating. Sonia, good to talk to you. Thank you very much. And Tim, thanks very much to you as well for joining us and for contributing to the discussion. Sir John Curtis, as usual, and as is right, gets the last word. And John, you've put in a stellar performance again. Can I just thank you on behalf of the team for all the work that you've done? We've got a few minutes left. When we look at these results, and then we have people like Sonia and Tim and others telling us that the main lesson here is that we see a system that has been fractured and alliances have been changed. Is that the main lesson we draw from these results, reinforcing that change?
I'm not sure that's the lesson I draw particularly from these results, because the truth is British politics began to be fractured at least 5 years ago in the wake of the EU referendum, and in part what we're now simply seeing is that continuing to be played out. And certainly the fact that the Liberal Democrats perhaps are going to start challenging the Conservatives in the south of England, in one sense, I think one could interpret that as a return to some of the traditional politics that we saw before Brexit. Indeed, you know, one of the interesting things about the Liberal Democrats' success in the Shropshire North by-election, and indeed their success yesterday in Somerset, is it suggests that the party is beginning to be able to act as a party of protest, even in Leave voting areas, and despite the fact that it was, of all of the parties, it's the party that's most associated with opposition to Brexit. But that's, in a sense, the Liberal Democrats going back to their traditional roles. So I'm not sure I take the view that the main lesson tonight is that suddenly British politics is different, but rather, if anything, that something that we used to take for granted in British politics, but then disappeared after the decision of the Liberal Democrats to enter into government in 2010 might actually be returning.
A very brief comment then, John. I'm sorry to rush you at the end like this. When we look at that big battle between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, how should we be seeing that battle in the light of these results?
Well, I remember in the argument that was going on amongst commentators about how many seats the Conservatives might lose, I argued, well, look, the outer limit of what the Conservatives could really possibly lose was about 1 in 4 of the seats they were defending, i.e. 350 seats. Well, what have we discovered the Conservatives have lost? 350 seats. So although these elections haven't produced dramatic headlines of thousands of seat losses or changes of council control, actually for this particular set of local elections in these particular circumstances, the loss the Conservatives have suffered is quite heavy. It's just that we thought it would be Labour that would inflict the damage rather than the Liberal Democrats. But for Labour, certainly, while, yes, it's recovered from the very poor set of local election results last year, we are still looking in opposition, as both Tim and Sonia suggested, that still has an awful lot of work to do to persuade the public to regard it as an effective alternative government, as perhaps sometimes a party that's a reasonably effective opposition to the current administration.
Sir John Curtis, thank you very much indeed for a concluding thought there at the end of this nearly 24 hours of election broadcasting for these local elections of 2022 in England, Scotland and Wales, and the Assembly elections in Northern Ireland. I'd like to thank the team involved in a big production like this, because it is an enormous team. So to all of those behind the scenes, an army of people, can I thank them all on behalf of BBC News. And of course to you for watching. The debate will continue. There's more analysis for you on the BBC News channel and on BBC News online. And of course BBC News at 10 is coming up in 30 minutes time. But from all of us, thanks for watching and goodbye.